So in this video, I wanted to address, I would say, a common misconception that all dilution is created equal. And what I mean by that is I see that most people seem to think that ATMs, convertibles, warrants, etc., are all kind of used the same way. Um, and with the thesis being, oh, okay, it's this. They have an ATM, they're going to use it, or these warrants are in the money, they're gonna sell them. Um, when that's not the case, every investor, underwriter, et cetera, they all kind of have their own ways of using or disposing of dilution. Kind of similar to U.S. traders. When you have a position that's maybe in the money or whatnot, you have a system and methodology for how you're going to exit that position. They're the same way. And you can kind of identify these patterns either within the same company or across more than one company that share a similar underwriter or same investor. So I'm going to go through a couple examples of kind of how you can identify these patterns. So I'll go through a couple. We'll start with FOXO. So this one had a multi-day run just recently, this one right here. And in general chat, I was talking about how, so they have this vote coming up where they are going to vote on a reverse split and then a couple other votes to approve basically the issuance of a lot of shares for that are being converted from debt. So basically a lot of dilution is coming. And so if you look back, you see that they actually had something similar back here in May 2023. You see, so they're here, they're voting on a reverse split, they're voting on the issue of shares in various scenarios, also from debt conversion. So that was May 2023, which is similar to what they're voting on now. And if you look back, they had this run back here a couple months prior. If you look at the intraday chart, which I posted here, this was the run a couple months before the vote, and then this is the run we're having now. You can see very similar setup here. So here not necessarily going any deeper than that, but you can already see a pattern of, this is what it did before a similar fundamental catalyst, and then here's what it's doing now. It's shaping up the same way. So kind of at these junctures, you can kind of anticipate where's the high probability area to get in. Now, and I covered this in a previous video, but obviously the shares can't technically be sold yet. But oftentimes the person who's getting the shares is going to start initiating a short position, especially prior to the vote, because if you look at any chart prior to a reverse split, especially, it generally fades into that. So they, naturally are going to want to short as much as possible before that. But that's just one example. Sorry, cut out there. So basically this is an example of kind of a pattern of going into a fundamental catalyst. So we identified the behavior before a similar fundamental catalyst, and now it's kind of developing again. So this is where you get the edge from of anticipating what might happen next. And not to go off on a tangent, but also another thing to keep in mind is these, this kind of fits the profile of these stocks that do this. These they take on a ton of debt and they convert it to equity, and they have to vote to approve that. Rather than going the route that we see other stocks where they have like a shelf, and then their kind of MO is doing registered offerings, issuing warrants, doing warrant inducement deals. They kind of have their own sort of MO where they're usually not necessarily multi-day runners. They'll have these big gaps on day one, and then they'll do whatever they want to do in terms of setting up, preparing for an offering or dumping warrants or hedging warrants or whatever on those gaps. Whereas you'll see with these like debt conversion stocks, they actually often have these multi-day runs. So FOXO was one. CEI, for those of you that remember, it's not even listed anymore. This also kind of, this one had multiple multi-day runs because it had to vote on, because they were diluting it so much. They like almost every few months or so, they had to vote on approving the issuance of all this dilution. So they kind of had these multi-day runs. TTOO was another that had also a big debt to equity conversion last year. Also prior to a vote and a reverse split, you see the multi-day run. You'll see this actually pretty often. Could I maybe even figure out a way some of you could look into this pattern and maybe even determine a way to get long ahead of it. I haven't yet. I just basically wait for the backside to come in on the daily chart. But anyways, that's just not to go off on too much of a tangent there. But you kind of have, I guess what I'm getting at is you kind of have these the convertible note holders, people that participate in the offerings, the underwriters. They all kind of have like their MO. So if you can identify the connection between those, find historical patterns, then you can get an edge from that. And if you look at our YouTube channel, I go over a lot of examples like that. Like with if you look at the HOLO MLGO one. That was an example where it's the same people involved. Those ones turned out pretty much the same. They had the multi-day run, that's MLGO, and then they got back to diluting. Same exact convertible note deal, multi-day run. Multi-day run here, got back to diluting. TWG, this is another one I did a video on. So they had the same exact underwriter. They pulled the same trap where on this first day they dropped an offering, they trapped it, and then they ran it, and then they dumped that the shares from the offering on this day. So they had the same underwriter, a CTNT, who pulled the exact same playbook, the trap. They did the offering this day, trapped everybody pre-market and ran it, and then they dumped later on. So that's an example of basically similar parties being involved. Another one, I just want to go through a couple of examples. One I found, NIVF did this convertible note deal with this JAK investor, and so did PEV. And this was cool. This was interesting because I looked in our database of basically these investors that participate in these small cap offerings, and they only appeared across a couple stocks, and PEV and NIVF were two of them. And if you look, I was actually just looking at it. They kind of have this MO of like, at least the recent gaps that they did was it kind of opens weak here and then just sort of grinds back mid-morning. This is PEV. And then NIVF, same kind of thing. Weak open, grinds back, right? And then these ones even had a couple. They sustained for a couple days before they collapsed. Let's see here. Yeah, I mean the other ones I don't really have to go over again. If you look at our YouTube channel, I do a couple videos on these, basically just finding these patterns of the same parties involved. Or different fundamental catalysts like with FOXO. But basically what I'm getting at is, don't assume that if there's dilution, it's in the money, they have an ATM or whatever it is that, okay, well, they're going to be selling it, or, they're all going to treat it the same way. All these different participants, they have kind of have their own method of doing things. So if you identify what that is, then that will give you an edge.